Monica Nesbit is here. She was a student civil rights leader in Arkansas. So the time period that we talked about when we looked at To Kill a Mockingbird, where slaves were free in the United States, but we were still living in a segregated world. Miss Nesbit can tell us some about that and how she dealt with those kinds of laws in our country. Miss Nesbit, could you tell us your story?
Yes. Your teacher, Mrs. Summers, asked me to share my story about how I became a part of the civil rights movement and why I decided to engage in civil disobedience. Back in the early 60s, I was a college student in Little Rock, Arkansas. During that time period in America, people were often treated differently based on their skin color. Many people thought that non-whites didn't deserve the same rights and privileges. That meant that people like me couldn't eat at restaurants or enjoy public places like whites could. In those days, some stores had lunch counters where customers could eat a meal, but not everybody could. I was allowed to buy things in the store, but I could not eat or drink from the water fountains like other customers. This was especially hard for me as a student, since I had to walk more than a mile, often in blazing heat, to reach the store, arriving, and sometimes I was just hot and thirsty. Though slavery ended many years before, there were written and unwritten laws limitations like Jim Crow laws. Jim Crow laws were state and local laws that enforced racial segregation in the southern United States. These laws were unfair and un-American. And as a student and an American, I thought it was important to stand up against the unfairness and injustice for me and my fellow Americans who were not being treated fairly. Our goal was to ensure that as outlined in the Declaration of Independence promise, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights. Among them are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. As a result, I became a part of a student movement called the Nonviolence Coordinating Committee, also known as SNCC. Students from all across the southern United States participated in this movement, engaging in civil disobedience. This meant that we refused to observe the unfair base practices that prevented us from being treated respectfully. During our breaks from class, we would make long walks to the stores and sit in at the lunch counters, asking to be served simply to be treated as customers. However, we were often ignored and mistreated, spat upon, food thrown on us, and hit by the customers, while the police looked on. The police did not protect us or prevent others from mistreating us. We were also sprayed with mace, causing pain and discomfort. Even though we often feared for our safety, we knew how important it was to stand our ground so that we and generations after us would be treated fairly and with dignity and respect. As a Christian, I relied on my faith and assurance of God's word for comfort and peace. While my friends and I suffered during this time, I was reassured by stories of Jesus suffering for injustice and unfairness. God's word provided assurance that those who were persecuted for righteousness' sake are blessed and will seek the kingdom of heaven. Matthew 5:10, 2 Timothy 4:17. Using Jesus' example, I forgave those because of their ignorance who tormented me. Luke 6:27-28. Using Jesus as example, I remain focused on helping others. Romans 12:10-13. Using Jesus as example, I prayed for strength in the midst of difficulty and uncertainty. Psalms 18:32. I encourage you to do that as well. When things are difficult, look to God's words for reassurance and guidance. It will always be a light for your path. One of the most famous songs and slogans sung and chanted by me and others that were a part of SNCC was, "We shall overcome." We shall overcome. We shall overcome. We shall overcome someday. Oh, deep in my heart, I do believe we shall overcome someday. Now, even now, when I see or learn of injustices in the world, I think of this song. My hope is that we shall overcome someday. Before I answer questions that you may have, I'd like to thank Mrs. Summers for giving me the opportunity to speak with you today. And thank you for listening and remembering to set an example in your communities.
I've had the pleasure of knowing Ms. Nesbit as a congregation member for 7 years. You all may not realize this, but she is a national treasure. Folks who participated in this are going to become fewer and fewer for us to be able to talk to. And so it's such a holy privilege for us to be able to hear from her. The thing you need to understand is when you are being called to do the right thing, when you're being called to do the right courageous thing, at the time, it may be way not normal. What Ms. Nesbit was dealing with, you all would have a hard time imagining today because most of that stuff, you wouldn't necessarily know what it would be like to walk in the skin of a person of color. But back then, the rules were just different and they were normal. And people basically said, well, don't mess with this. The thing I asked Ms. Nesbit about this afternoon or this morning before we got on was, I said, Ms. Nesbit, did your mama know you were sitting in at that lunch counter? And the answer is, no, she did not. Ms. Nesbit was from Cincinnati, and she went to school at a Methodist school down in Little Rock. And her said, okay, I'll let you go down there, but don't you get involved with that mess. But Ms. Nesbit felt like she needed to be a part of something that was on the cusp of changing, and it needed to change. But understand, when she went into that lunch counter, she knew it could really cost her big.
Yes.
She could have been arrested. She could have been wounded. She was certainly humiliated. She certainly had some clothes ruined. Isn't that right, Ms. Nesbit?
Of course, yes.
So they would stand behind her, pour mustard on her. They would poke her in the back. She didn't know if that was a gun, a knife, a stick, a finger. And then she and others were maced as they were sitting with their school books at the lunch counter. Now, we have a hard time imagining this, but the truth is President Lincoln had called us to our better angels, all the way back at the end of the Civil War, second inaugural address, and yet these same things were core residents. So coming back, so I want to stop right there and see if any of you all have questions. Ms. Nesbit was 18 years old when this happened. She was a freshman in college.
Yeah.
Ms. Nesbit was part of a group that were following the instructions of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. Most of you hear that name. Most of you see streets that have that name. But the truth is, he brought peaceful, nonviolent civil disobedience to the table to basically call America to live up to its stated principles. All people are created equal, but they weren't living that way. And so basically they were pointing America to its better angels. And they were doing this as people of faith. Dr. Martin Luther King was a reverend. After every day that they sat in the lunch counters, Ms. Nesbit and other students went to a Methodist church and they had prayer services every night. They were trying to cover each other in prayer. But what they were doing was courageous, and what they were doing was potentially going to get them a criminal record or injury.
Okay, I have a question for you, Ms. Nesbit, from Vincent. So, Vincent, we're going to get yourself unmuted there. Okay.
Mrs. Nesbit, how long did you do these nonviolent protests for early? How long were you part of this?
Yes. Well, we started, it took us about a year to a year and a half. And one November morning, we our trustees and the college president said to us, you can participate in the sit-in demonstrations, but you'd have to return to class. And then we would sit, and then we would walk back those over a mile back to class, and then back down to Woolworths. And so it took us about a year, a little over a year. I believe it was in February the following year. I was a freshman then in 1960 when we started. And after the November macing, where the White Citizen Council came into the store and sprayed all the students with mace, we all jumped up, we ran out of the store, and I and another student remained at the counter. We went back. And at that time, the local news picked it up, and then the national news.
She says, did you become a part of the group on your own, or were you invited by a friend?
I was one of the student leaders. We had about 6 student leaders. When Dr. Martin Luther King, when we notified him that we were not allowed to drink or sit at the lunch counters, he sent a representative from Atlanta to form the group at Philander. And I was selected as one of the student leaders. And then after we integrated the lunch counters, Dr. Martin Luther King came to Little Rock with the First Baptist Church and set all 6 of us leaders down in front of him and congratulated us and told us what a contribution we had made to the civil rights movement in Arkansas. And he signed his book, Strive Towards Freedom, for each one of us. The students from the southern states, their parents, most of them were domestic workers. And the people that they worked for had threatened their parents that if your child participates in this protest, we're going to fire you. So they know that they needed their job so that they could pay their tuition for their child to go to school. So they could not participate. However, how they did participate, they would make signs for us and make hot chocolate. So when we would meet at Wesley United Methodist Church on the campus, those students from the South they were supported by making signs, protest signs for us.
Sometimes we talk about courage being, all big and tough, but one of the things that's clear in the Gospels, and one of the things that's clear in this action of friends helping each other and doing what others is courage is us stepping up and speaking for those who have no voice.
Mm-hmm.
She says, do you fear for your children or grandchildren when it comes to racism now?
Abby, yes. I'm very disappointed. I participated in the civil rights movement in 1960, but still today, I never thought that my children and grandchildren would have to go through some of the discriminations that they're going through now on jobs, in schools. And I do have a fear, and I'm 79 years old, and I don't know if I will live long enough to see this change, but I pray that the injustice, the equality for all, that my eyes will be able to witness this. But if not, I hope my children and grandchildren will.